So you have to train hard to get stronger in powerlifting.
No shit.
But the problem with training hard is that accumulating fatigue is inevitable. But the solution isn't just to eliminate fatigue, because you'll end up holding back progress. So what's the point then? So the point is to manage fatigue well, and what gets measured gets managed. But then again, it's not just about knowing how to monitor fatigue if you don't know when accumulated fatigue becomes too much. So in this video, I will go through what fatigue actually is and how to measure fatigue in a program and how to know when there is too much. On top of that, if you'd watched to the end, I will also go through some false signs of fatigue. Now, this is important because reacting from false sign of fatigue will make you deload prematurely.
What did you say?
Prematurely. Now, what do we mean and not mean by fatigue? So first things first, what do we mean by fatigue? I will preface this by saying that when it comes to tracking fatigue, we are coming from the perspective as a coach, not necessarily the athlete. Now, not that the athlete's perspective is not important. The main definition of fatigue we are talking about is that which masks real-time performance. Now, we can visually understand this if we bring back the important concept, the fitness and fatigue model. The fitness and fatigue model is a fundamental concept in training theory that explains how performance changes in response to a training stimulus. At its core, the model suggests that training produces two opposing effects at the same time. Now, the positive effect, which is fitness, improves the performance potential. The negative fatigue effect that temporarily masks performance capabilities. The real-time performance at any given time is the result of the combined effect of these two elements. This explains why performance may be reduced immediately after training, but then adaptations occur through proper recovery through supercompensation when fatigue dissipates while fitness still remains. Understanding this model helps us make better decisions about how we program each training day, when to push training and when to reduce training stress, how to time deloads and peak and tapers. Now, what do I not necessarily mean by fatigue? Well, what I don't think about too much regarding fatigue is how the athlete may conceptualize it when they use the word. By this, I mean the subjective experience of various symptoms that the athlete often complains about, including muscle soreness, lack of alertness, brain fog, and a general sense of tiredness.
That's right. Cry.
This is because these experiences can still be felt when training stress is high, but they're not necessarily indicative of what the athlete can and cannot do on any given day. But before we move on, there's one thing that we do need to know. We do not spot absolute fatigue. There is no such thing as measuring fatigue. When it comes to monitoring fatigue, we are really looking out for the relative changes in excessive fatigue. Now, generally speaking, we could define excess fatigue by that which takes our performance trend in towards a negative direction. So let's talk about acute versus chronic fatigue. Now, there is a difference between acute fatigue and chronic fatigue. So what is acute fatigue? Acute fatigue is temporary and typically occurs after a single training session or a short period of training. It's characterized by a temporary drop in performance that can be resolved relatively quickly by allowing recovery, usually within a matter of days. Now, this fatigue we expect to see day to day within a well-designed program. We can manage these through managing our other training days in the immediate term. Chronic fatigue, on the other hand, is more persistent and develops over time when recovery is consistently inadequate relative to that training stress. Now, this type of fatigue accumulates gradually, requiring more extensive recovery measures like deload blocks. And ultimately, this is what we're trying to avoid by monitoring fatigue and managing it effectively. Obviously, poorly managed training dose and consistent buildup of acute fatigue can lead to chronic fatigue. And chronic fatigue often happens across multiple weeks, even months, if training gets really that hard. Now, this is associated more with overtraining syndrome. Symptoms include persistent decreased performance, disrupted sleep patterns, loss of appetite, and mood changes like irritability and depression. Now, these symptoms tend to persist even with adequate rest between sessions. It's crucial to catch chronic fatigue early before it develops into full-blown overtraining syndrome. But then, why is it important to distinguish between acute and chronic fatigue? First, it helps us make better programming decisions. We can quickly alleviate acute fatigue when appropriate, but need to take more serious action when chronic fatigue appears. Second, it prevents us from overreacting to normal training fatigue while ensuring that we don't underreact to more serious fatigue accumulation that could lead to overtraining. Fundamentally, tells us that it's important to look a bit further back to training more than just last week. So let's talk about how fatigue affects training. Fatigue, specifically excess fatigue, will obviously suppress how much weight you can lift. We can call this top-end performance. But here's the thing, top-end performance isn't the only way fatigue can affect your training. Fatigue can also influence our work capacity. But then what even is work capacity? Work capacity we can conceptualize as the ability to repeat a certain performance. It's the ability to maintain performance across multiple sets or even sessions. So when we get increasing in excess fatigue, we may easily see a reduction in work capacity in those sessions. Now that we understand what fatigue is and how it can affect our training, let's dive into how to spot it. One important point that I will say is that when there is excess fatigue, it can manifest in the following signals. But the important thing to remember is that these signals do not always mean that the athlete is in a state of excess fatigue. Now, if you watch to the end, you'll find out what else these signals could mean. So let's start with the first signal, flatlining or reduction in E1RM. This is the most objective sign. One of the clearest signs of excess fatigue is when the athlete's estimated 1 rep max stops increasing or starts to drop. This happens because of where a lifter is on the dose response curve. Training stress dries adaptations up, but up to a certain point, and beyond that, excess fatigue starts interfering with recovery. If there is a flatline in E1RM, the athlete may be handling heavier weights, but their estimated top end strength isn't actually going up. This suggests that they are at the adaptive ceiling. They're just able to recover back to baseline. Higher RPE for the same weight and reps. If an athlete used to hit a certain load at RP7, but now it feels like an RP8 or 9, they are carrying excessive fatigue. A higher RPE for the same weight or reps. If an athlete used to hit a certain load at RP7 and now it feels like RP8 or 9, this could be a sign of excess fatigue. At the same time, a lower weight required to hit the same RP and reps, if they have to drop the load just to maintain that relative intensity, fatigue could also be actively suppressing them. In both of these three scenarios, we can say that the athlete is training at or above their maximal recoverable dose. Now, one thing to remember is that it might not necessarily occur from a progression from programming. The athlete might just have really negative externals. In either case, it may be a signal for you as the coach or the lifter to reduce the training dose in subsequent training sessions or weeks. The next one is declining work capacity. As I mentioned before, excess fatigue doesn't just reduce peak strength, it can lower the athlete's ability to sustain performance across sets. So the first place this shows up is in the fatigability, how quickly an RPE climb across multiple sets in straight sets. Here's an example. If an athlete starts a session of 3 sets of 5 at RP6 of the first set, but then in the next week session, they start a session at RP6 but reaches RP9 by the last set, assuming that there's the same number of sets, that is a sign of reduced work capacity. If they used to maintain performance over 5 sets of a fixed weight but now struggles by set 3, fatigue is limiting their repeatability. The second red flag is the drop in accessory exercise performance. If an athlete ends up performing lower loads for the accessory exercises for the same muscle groups as their main lifts, this can be a sign of fatigued work capacity too. The next thing we need to talk about is qualifying signs. Now, when looking at fatigue in training, it's helpful to look at qualifying signs that can strengthen our hypothesis about whether an athlete is experiencing excess fatigue. One important metric is tonnage, the total amount of weight lifted across all sets and reps in a training block. If we see significant increase in tonnage compared to what the athlete typically handles, this could explain why we're seeing signs of fatigue if the E1RM is trending downwards. However, it's crucial to note that what constitutes excessive training dose isn't fixed. An athlete who's cutting weight or dealing with poor sleep might not be able to recover from what was previously manageable training stress. And the practical implication is that we need to adjust the training dose based on the athlete's current recovery capacity, not just their historical ability to handle load and intensity. This might mean reducing volume, intensity, or both until the athlete's recovery capacity improves and external stressors are better managed. And so now we move on to behavioral signs. There are also some behavioral signs that may or may not be apparent when looking at just the recorded program itself. Many lifters and some coaches often overlook the observation of lifters skipping accessories. Whether it's partially or completely skipping it, sometimes this may be laziness or lack of conviction of knowing why they're doing those accessories. Sometimes it might be that those muscle groups are just so fatigued that they're just unconsciously auto-regulating the program. It's worth exploring why the lifter might be skipping accessories, whether they were just systematically fatigued or whether it's excessive muscle soreness locally. Another sign of fatigue that doesn't often show up in programs is technique breakdown. Now, if the movement quality deteriorates through a set or across sets, there's probably signs of localized fatigue in particular muscle groups. Now, this will show up in a form of compensation in technique. For example, if the quads fatigue sooner in the deadlifts, the lifter may start rounding their back or shifting towards the hips. This is fundamentally why I'm not a big fan of providing lifters with programming only without looking at the context of how they are moving in training. Now, when it comes to technique variability, there can be 2 types: endpoint variability and coordinated variability. Now, coordinated variability refers to the variability of the journey between the endpoints in a repetition. These may be your casual misgrooves that aren't too problematic. And I say this because the lifter is able to self-organize and self-correct during the repetition. Endpoint variability is when there is variability at the endpoints of a repetition. So where the barbell ends up at the top and bottom changes. Now, this is more problematic. Another potential behavioral sign of fatigue is that if the athlete either needs to extend their rest times, and when there is excess fatigue in that lifter, you are more likely to see signs of coordinative variability. Another potential behavioral sign of fatigue is if the athlete either needs to extend their rest times between sets. Now, this isn't always a bad thing if it is done within reason, for example, like 1 to 2 extra minutes. Now, if it gets excessive to the point that the athlete rests 10 or more minutes, and you know who you are,
One eternity later.
then this may be worth taking into consideration. A similar behavioral sign is when the lifter feels so sore or fatigued that they start to auto-regulate their rest days by adding more rest days. Now, if it is the odd rest day because of life events, this may be acceptable depending on where the athlete is in their block. But ultimately, the problem lies to defaulting to this, as this just simply reduces the training frequency over time. Now, coaches can spot this if their athletes are taking longer than usual to complete their microcycle, assuming that they usually stick to a 1 week long microcycle. Increased reliance on caffeine or stimulant-based pre-workouts is another coping mechanism for not being able to recover from that excess fatigue. Now, this one can be a little bit more insidious because of the obvious reason that people don't really talk about their pre-workouts that much, and it can obviously impact how deep the athletes sleep and subsequently how well they can recover. Now, when an athlete reaches the stage of overtraining long term, you can start to get overtraining symptoms, which include overuse injuries such as tendinopathy, illness, and poor mood.
Push it out. Everything you got. Everything you got. Everything you got.
There are, however, fake signals of fatigue. Now, when the athlete complains of soreness, brain fog, or fatigue, they should contribute to the bigger picture of the athlete. However, they may not necessarily guarantee that they are in excess fatigue. It's important to know that some athletes will always experience this, so you shouldn't always solely rely on these indicators. However, outside of fatigue, there may be reasons why performance may be flat or downward trending. Understimulating, frequency, and how the training split is organized can also contribute to this. Now, if you want me to make a video exploring these other potential detractors of performance, signal to me with a like and subscribe, and I'll promise I will make this as one of my next videos. And as always, thank you for watching.